Some stuff to do. So you can find your seat, that would be good. We'll pray and we'll dive right in. We've got some scripture to look at, like a lot of it. So try to make our way. Let's go ahead and find a seat. Let's go ahead and pray. So pray with me if you can. Father, thank you for the time that we have together this morning in your word. Thank you for the ways that you shape our thinking and you challenge our thinking as we look into your word. We want to conform our thinking to your word more and more and more throughout our lives. And we need your Spirit's help to do that. So would you be at work this morning as we continue looking into your word? Thank you for the ways that it is such a unified and beautiful, grand story. And we pray that we would see it that way and value it for what it is. So thank you for giving us such a gift that we could have in our own lap, as it were, in our own language and in our own homes. We pray that it wouldn't just be there, but it would be in our hearts as well as we take it in through the intentional act of reading and studying and listening. So would you help us do that well now as we look into these difficult things that we're continuing to talk about from Romans. So thank you for this opportunity to look into your word together as God's people. We long to hear you speak. So speak, and speak in a way that makes us different. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So instead of opening to the book of Romans, I'd like for you to open to the book of Deuteronomy. I'd like to start there and make our way over into Romans as quickly as you can. So last week we talked about this mystery aspect that Paul introduces in Romans 11:25. And the mystery that I defined that term very specifically as something that was partially revealed in the Old Testament and is more fully revealed in the New Testament. Actually, it doesn't have to have those contours. There are mystery ideas in the Old Testament themselves. And so you have, for example, Daniel's visions, or the vision given to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 is referred to with the mystery language. And so the vision that's given to Nebuchadnezzar is called the mystery. And then Daniel's interpretation of that is the revelation of mystery that God gives to him. And it seems like Paul's usage of the term mystery is borrowed there directly from Daniel's usage. And so that's kind of our pivotal paradigm for understanding the idea of mystery in the Scripture as something that's partially revealed, like in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He was given all the data in picture form. He just didn't know how to connect the dots. Daniel comes along with the inspired interpretation that connects the proper dots and gives the proper interpretation. It's the same thing we're looking at from Old Testament prophecy to New Testament fulfillment. We need the apostles' guidance and Jesus' guidance as we try to connect the Old Testament dots. So the mystery is something that's there in the Old Testament. It's always been there. It's just not on the surface. It can be seen there, but it needs some unpacking and it needs to be connected in certain ways. And Paul's leading us into that in Romans 11 with this particular issue having to do with the salvation of Israel. And the mystery that we talked about is the sequence. We're familiar with the sequence to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. That's very regular in the New Testament, repeated in several different places, both by Paul and reflected by Jesus' teaching. However, there is another pattern, and that's what Paul is honing our attention on. And he's saying that this mystery is that there's a partial hardening on Israel and the Gentiles, so that the fullness of the Gentiles would be saved. And so that you get Jew first and then the Gentile, but now as the hardening of Israel takes place in Paul's day and on through to our day as well, there's a predominantly Gentile salvation, while Jewish salvation is going to come after or in the midst of. And so we have to look and think through, how does that work? But I want to show you in the Old Testament where I think Paul connects these dots first and foremost. And you're going to see it's there, but you just reading Deuteronomy might not guess it's there. It's kind of implied. And given that Paul's reading Deuteronomy through the lens of what Jesus has done, he can now see what was there all along, but kind of underneath the surface. So I'll try to tie those threads for you. I'm going to be a little bit quick here because I want to get down to Paul's further explanation of this in his quotation of Scripture in Romans 11:26 and 27. And so I'm going to give you a sketch outline here, and I will show you the pivotal pieces, but we're going to gloss over a lot of detail that I wanted to go into, but I'm going to avoid for the sake of time. So Deuteronomy 30 is where we're looking here. Deuteronomy chapter 30. And so from chapter 30 to 32, as Moses closes out this book, where you have a collection of Moses' sermons to the generation of Israelites who are actually going to cross the Jordan River and go in without Moses in just a bit. And so he's reminding them of the law, and he is interpreting that law to them as the second generation, as they're getting ready to go into the land, and he is charging them and challenging them and also prophesying about them to them in these final chapters. Chapter 32, in particular, is a song that is given to Moses from God that is meant to be an indictment of the people, announcing that ahead of time that you're going to break this covenant really quickly, and God also is going to restore you and provide salvation after judgment. So that's all a part of this, and these are the pieces that Paul is actually looking at. So we've talked about Deuteronomy 30 in our discussions here because in Romans 10, Paul quoted Deuteronomy 30 and made a big deal out of it. And in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 14, we get a picture of the restoration of Israel following their rebellion and judgment. Okay, so there's the announcement that you guys are going to rebel, God's going to judge you, but God is going to restore you after that. Everything hinges on the promise of Yahweh in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, that he will circumcise the hearts of the people. So the restoration of the people is dependent on that God would circumcise the hearts of his people. And so we move into Deuteronomy 31, and he's kind of setting up the song that comes in chapter 32. And this is primarily telling us what judgment and restoration is going to look like. So now we move into some of the details. In chapter 31, we see Israel's rebellion prophesied. Let me just give you a glimpse. Deuteronomy 30, 31, 20, and 21. For when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and grown fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them, and despise me and break my covenant. And when many evils and troubles have come upon them, that's evils and troubles that have come upon them from God in judgment, this song shall confront them as a witness, for it will live unforgotten in the mouths of their offspring. For I know what they are inclined to do even today, before I have brought them into the land that I swore to give. That's the setup for chapter 32 right there. That's what the song is all about. They're supposed to have this song. They're supposed to sing this song to remind them of how bad they are and how they're going to break it all. And also how God is going to save them after the fact. So that's all a part of this. That's the setup. So their rebellion is prophesied. We could look at several other verses where it's repeated. That's the major theme in these sections, is they're going to rebel, they're going to commit idolatry, they're going to reject the Lord, they're going to break his covenant. And then we get, in Deuteronomy 32, as part of this song, in response to their rebellion, God is going to reject them. And he tells them that up front. There is a rejection of Israel. And that's what Paul's been talking about. He's talking about their rejection. Their rejection. Where does he get that language? Deuteronomy 32. And so we could look at verses 19 to 21, the first part of verse 21. So Deuteronomy 32, starting in verse 19. Yahweh saw it. He's just described the idolatry of the people in the previous verses. Yahweh saw it and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faithfulness. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. Now notice there that God is introducing jealousy language. That's important for our discussion in Romans 10 and 11. Romans 10, he quoted from this section to talk about how God is going to bring salvation to Israel by making them jealous. Well, he's quoting from the second half of verse 21 here. And the reason that that's an appropriate judgment to them is that they made him jealous. So they made God jealous by committing adultery and in the form of idolatry, worshiping other idols. They abandoned him as their husband. And so they've made him jealous. And so he's responding in the proper jealousy of a spurned or cuckolded husband who's been cheated on. And he responds with fury to reclaim his bride and to preserve the covenant of marriage. But here there is punishment to them as well, because they have done this willingly, blatantly, and high-handedly. And so the judgment is announced there. God's rejection of the people is on display there. He goes on to continue that theme in verses 22 and 23. We don't need to read those for now. So what I'm looking at here is the sequence. That's what we're paying attention to here. There's rebellion, Israel's rebellion, God's rejection of the people, and Israel's jealousy. That's what we need to hone in on in the second half of verse 21 here. So Israel's jealousy is prophesied. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. This is the part that Paul quotes in Romans chapter 10. In Romans 10:19, Paul quotes these words to say that is how God is going to bring salvation to Israel. Now here, he's showing that this is going to be the way he brings judgment to Israel. And this is where we have to again keep together the ideas of judgment and salvation. They are not two separate categories. God's acts of judgment accomplish salvation, like all the time. God brings salvation through judgment for his glory from Genesis to Revelation and everywhere in between. Think of the cross. The death of Jesus is an act of God's judgment that brings salvation. Judgment to Jesus, salvation to those who trust him. Think of the book of Exodus and the story of Exodus. God brings judgment against the Egyptians. And in the midst of that judgment, there's also a judgment that includes the Israelites, the Passover lamb. Those lambs that were sacrificed were substituted for the lives of the Israelites because they were just as much idolaters as the Egyptians were. They deserved to die and to be eliminated right there, right then. But he didn't. He said, take the lamb, kill it, spread its blood over the doorposts of your home. And if in that act you are trusting that I am going to come through and not kill you. And that's exactly what happened. An act of judgment that brings salvation. Judgment on the Egyptians brings salvation for Israel there. And in the middle of it, to hold those two things together, is the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. It's key here to understand that connection. And so here, we have to read this at two levels. Again, what is the fulfillment of this? So if, as they're singing this song, the Israelites crossing the Jordan River and going into the land with this on their minds, at least they should have been, what are they thinking? So when we make God jealous by our idolatry, because he says that's going to happen, then he says, then out of that, therefore, so I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. How is that fulfilled? Well, it's got a dual fulfillment. The first initial on the surface fulfillment is when the Babylonians, the no people, and the foolish nation come in and wipe out the Jews and flatten the temple. So God's going to make them jealous. He's going to exile them. He's going to use Babylon. Why would that make them jealous? Well, because Israel was God's rod of judgment. As they go into the land of Canaan, he's using them to judge wicked people. Well, now he's going to use a wicked nation to judge them. That should provoke them to jealousy. But it doesn't. At least not the right kind of jealousy. And that's where we see the further fulfillment, the way that Paul pulls this over into his understanding of what's going on with the gospel. As the gospel goes out to Gentiles and brings salvation to them, they are then provoked to jealousy, and that's what moves them to accept the gospel. So Paul takes this verse that's got these two layers to it. It's communicating both ideas. But they probably would have only seen the first one initially. In light of the Babylonian destruction of Judah and Jerusalem and the temple, they would have seen that. The provocation of jealousy would have been how God used the Babylonians in a similar parallel way to the way he had earlier used Israel as the rod of his judgment against other nations, the nations in the land of Canaan. And so here he's using the pagan nation Babylon to do the same exact thing. That's their job, and yet that job has been taken over by the Babylonians. That should provoke them to jealousy. But here, there's no clear articulation in this verse that is going to lead to salvation for them. That just continues their judgment. So they're out in exile under the Babylonians, and then as the Babylonians fade away, the Persians, and as the Persians fade away, you get the Greeks, and as the Greeks fade away, you get the Romans. All of them become the oppressors and rulers over Israel as they remain under the judgment of God all the way up until Jesus comes. They're still under the judgment of God even when they come back to the land. They're still under the judgment of God when they build their half-hearted temple. They're still under the judgment of God when Jesus shows up. And so as they look at that, they're looking at these pagans, and their jealousy is a kind of hostility, which fuels the way that you get this Jews hate Gentiles and that kind of relationship. But Paul sees something deeper here when he reads this text in light of what Jesus has done and how the gospel has gone out, and Israel, the Jewish people of his day, have now rejected the gospel. Whereas at first, many of them, thousands of them, accepted it. And now Paul recognizes this partial hardening that's come on. God's communicated this partial hardening. And so he's revealed that aspect of things, which is something else that's revealed in the Old Testament, that there would be this hardening. And Paul sees evidence of that here in this passage of all places, in Deuteronomy 32. The form that the judgment of Israel is taking is not just about their scattered dispersion around the world, but it's about the hardening of their hearts, the hardening of the majority of Israel. Paul puts it the other way. There's a partial hardening of Israel. And so the judgment that they're seeing here, where there's jealousy that's being provoked, Paul turns that and sees that as the key to all of it. So when he looks at this, when he sees, so I will make them jealous with those who are no people, he's no longer looking at it and saying that's talking about the Babylonians. Instead, he's looking at that and saying that's talking about Gentiles who are accepting the gospel. And that is doing two things also. So think about it. As Jewish people in Paul's day are watching Gentiles accept this Messiah, Jewish Messiah, or at least claim to be, they should interpret that in a couple of different ways. If they interpret it wrongly, then they're going to reject the Messiah. They're going to say he's not really the Messiah. That's the only answer they can really give. But if they see it as it's intended to be proclaimed that this is the true Messiah and the Gentiles have rejected it, they should be saying, now wait a minute, the Messiah is supposed to come to us. The Messiah is supposed to save us. Why are they claiming that the Jewish Messiah is saving them? And that's where the jealousy piece is turned by God to a salvific act, where his grace is put on display through the act of making someone jealousy, provoking them to jealousy. That's how Paul uses this verse in Romans 10. So we're kind of reviewing that piece. But here in Romans 11, he's included that aspect of this partial hardening as a part of this mystery, the sequence where there's been a flip-flop in the expected sequence. But he sees it implied here in Deuteronomy 32. And one of the ways he does that is if you keep reading in Deuteronomy 32, it's poetry, so it's not necessarily following straight line as a narrative in sequence, chronological sequence. But he does take the passage and he say, okay, let's keep reading on down. And he goes down to toward the conclusion of the song. And in the third to last stanza, there toward the end of the song in verses 34 to 38, you get another puzzling announcement of God's mercy for his people. And so if they've rebelled earlier in Deuteronomy 32, God's rejected them in Deuteronomy 32, he's provoked them to jealousy in Deuteronomy 32, and then he extends mercy to them in Deuteronomy 32 in the last section, verse 34 to 38. That is how Paul is drawing this sequence out as a mystery that's hidden there in the text. You've got to follow through the train of thought in Deuteronomy 32 to see how that logic works, and we're not going to take the time to explore all of how that's unfolding. But in verses 34 to 38, so let me show you where the mercy comes in. It's in verse 36, but it's in the midst of judgment. Again, it's not separated out. It's in the midst of judgment. For Yahweh will vindicate his people. That's actually just the Hebrew word for judge. But I think the ESV is correct here to translate it more positively, the idea of vindication. Yahweh will vindicate his people, because the second line is, and have compassion on his servants, when he sees that their power is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. That is the key verse here in all of this. Now, what provides a linchpin in this for me is that Paul is going to quote the last verse of this song. So Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. He's going to quote this verse in Romans 15. Now, if you're looking at your English Bible here in Deuteronomy 32:43, if you've got a modern English Bible like the ESV, you're going to see a footnote on almost every line of the song that tells you something about the translation is different. This is the last line of this song is very unclear as far as what exactly is the wording. And what's interesting about what Paul does when he quotes this in Romans 15, we'll look at this in just a second, he just quotes the very first line. It's just a couple of words. The ESV reads, "Rejoice with him, O heavens," but that's not what you'll read in Paul's quotation. And if you look at the footnote, You've got a footnote. If you've got the ESV, some other versions have a footnote as well. The ESV footnote says, this line, "Rejoice with him, O heavens," is following a Dead Sea Scroll, and it's also following the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And then it tells you that the Hebrew, which is the Masoretic text, reads, "Rejoice his people, O nations." That's the Hebrew that's there. Rejoice his people, O nations, that is Gentiles. And that's what you'll find if you flip over to Romans 15. And I invite you to do that with me. Go to Romans 15, and we'll see the logic again come up here. This is at the end of Paul's letter, so he's kind of recapping in some pieces of what he said already. And he takes this verse from Deuteronomy 32 and combines it with a bunch of other scripture in a sequence in Romans 15. The key line, quoting this line, is in verse 10, where Paul says, "And again it is said, Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people." And that's where you get the language, the term Gentiles. It's in the Hebrew text, and Paul seems to be following that here in his quotation here. Why is that important? Well, because here in Paul's letter to the Romans, he is showing that the promise of the salvation of Gentiles, that they would come to rejoice in connection with Israel, is the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. Look at Romans 15:8. "For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised," that's ethnic Jews, "to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." And then he's going to ground that statement in several verses of Scripture, as it is written. And he first quotes Psalm 18:49, a Davidic psalm there. "Therefore I, David, the Messiah," kind of communicating the messianic tone there, "will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name." And again it is said, Deuteronomy 32:43, "Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people." And again, "Praise the Lord, all you Gentiles," Psalm 117:1, "and let all the peoples extol him." And again, Isaiah says, verse 12 there, "The root of Jesse will come, even he who arises to rule the Gentiles. In him will the Gentiles hope." That's Isaiah 11:10. So he strings together all these Old Testament promises about Gentiles rejoicing and praising the God of Israel, which is implying their salvation in fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. He's tying off the whole Old Testament story right here in this little sequence. It's a beautiful picture if you can see it there. In Romans 11, he's doing something similar, but using the language of mystery. And that's where it boggles our minds a bit, and we have to look a little bit more carefully. Now, that was too fast, and I apologize for the speed of that. But I wanted to give you just, I guess, some data points that you could take to look at further later on. The key thing to see here is that Paul's making it clear that what's happening in his day, the rejection of the gospel by the Israelites, is a part of biblical prophecy. It is fulfilling prophecy. It is a part of the plan. It's not a new thing that God is doing. It was always anticipated, and it's a part of the story that they need to include. So, we need to do one more really hard thing, okay? We need to look at his quotation of Scripture in Romans 11:26 and 27. Because this is going to ground what he's saying here even further in a very specific set of texts. We've looked at the olive tree image. As Paul's fleshed this out, he's talked about the olive tree, which seems to be a representation of Israel. These branches that have been grafted in, natural branches being regrafted in, ethnic Jews receiving the gospel, being saved, wild olive shoots being grafted in, those are Gentiles trusting the gospel and being saved. And that's all painting this picture for us. So in verse 25, let me just read verses 25 to 27, and then we'll try to take it in really quickly again and look at the Old Testament underlying this. "Lest you be wise in your own sight," he's writing to Gentile Christians here in Rome, "lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. Partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." So, Paul is explaining how all Israel will be saved. We still have to come back around to discuss what is all Israel, which we will do. But we need to go here first, I think. So he's grounding this in Old Testament scripture. He's saying this is the way it was always supposed to be, and it was told to them it was going to be this way. But what Paul has done is tricky. So he's quoting primarily from Isaiah 59, verses 20 and 21. So I want you to hold your finger here and just take a glance at Isaiah 59, 20 and 21, because there's a key difference in the way that Paul quotes this verse. The difference matters. And this is one of those places where we have a lot to wrestle with, and we're going to just kind of scratch the surface here, and I'll try to get the point across as best I can. Isaiah 59, 20 and 21. So in Isaiah 59, 20 and 21, you'll read, "And a Redeemer will come to Zion." That's the key thing to kind of zoom in on here. A Redeemer will come to Zion. So Isaiah is announcing the coming of a Redeemer to Zion. And Zion is a poetic figure for Jerusalem. Okay? Now, it can be, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, a reference to either the earthly Jerusalem or the heavenly Jerusalem. Not always clear. Most of the time it is. But Zion is referring to Jerusalem. Sometimes the people of Jerusalem, sometimes the city specifically. But the prophecy is a Redeemer will come to Zion, to those in Jacob who turn from transgression. That would be a remnant, declares Yahweh, tying in with the rest of Isaiah's remnant theme. And he continues, "And as for me, this is my covenant with them, says Yahweh. My spirit that is upon you," probably addressing the messianic servant here, "and my words that I have put in your mouth shall not depart out of your mouth, or out of the mouth of your offspring," the servant's offspring, "or out of the mouth of your children's offspring, says Yahweh, from this time forth and forevermore." Now, Paul doesn't quote all of that. He just quotes the first few words in verse 21, and then he adds another verse from the Old Testament on to the end. So again, hold your fingers here. We're still in Isaiah and in Romans. Flip back over to Romans. "The deliverer will come from Zion," not to Zion. We'll talk about that in just a second. "He will banish ungodliness from Jacob." It's a little different than it reads in Isaiah. "And this will be my covenant with them." That's the end of his quotation from Isaiah 59, 20 and 21. And then he tacks on at the end, "when I take away their sins," words from Isaiah 27, 9. Okay, we're not going to go back and look at Isaiah 27, 9 for the sake of time. But he tacks on those words. It's all about the new covenant, okay? Similar words are stated in Jeremiah 31 about the new covenant explicitly, but that's what he's talking about here. It's very clear. Isaiah is discussing the nature of the new covenant in Isaiah 59. So, why does he change or seem to change to Zion to from Zion? That's not the same thing. There's no way you can shake that out to say that's the same thing. It's not the same. It's not saying the same idea. So I think, and this is where there's lots of debate as to what Paul is doing exactly. Some would say he can just change the text because he's an inspired apostle. I'm not comfortable with that, personally. But instead, he's borrowing that from Zion from another verse. Now, again, that's how do you know that? Well, very hard to verify. But I think that's the best explanation. So the phrase "from Zion," he's borrowing from Psalm 14:7. And it's important to see, why would he choose that text? Now, the phrase "from Zion" is used 10 or 11 times in the Old Testament, so how do I know it's Psalm 14:7? I don't. Could be some other places, but this one makes some interesting sense in our context. And so that's how we work out some of these things sometimes. So Psalm 14, a Psalm of David, and at the end, David is just expressing a longing for God to bring blessing to his people. He says, "Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion, from Zion." And given that Paul's talking about the salvation of Israel, I think he's borrowing this phrase from Psalm 14 and connecting it with Isaiah 59 to say, the new covenant that Isaiah was talking about in 59, Jesus is going to establish it coming from Zion. And when he does that, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and he's establishing the covenant with them, with the people of Israel, with all Israel. And it says, borrowing from Isaiah 27:9, "when I take away their sins." So, when is that? What's it talking about? And who cares? Those are the key questions, I think. Why does it matter? So what? Becomes the important question to answer here. Now, there's a couple of different ways to think about this. Regardless of whether you think Paul's playing fast and loose with Isaiah 59 and he's just changed to Zion or from Zion, you can think about this in a couple of different ways. The deliverer will come from Zion means the heavenly Jerusalem. So Jesus is in heaven right now. Okay? He's sitting at the right hand of God. He's in the heavenly Jerusalem. He's in Zion. He went to Zion when he ascended. Okay? And so you could see this as saying this is talking about when Jesus returns in the future. He's going to come from the heavenly Zion to the earth, and at that time he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. That's possible. I don't follow that line myself. The reason being, for me, primarily, is Jesus has already done the work to take away the sins of the people. That happened in his first coming, not his second coming. He's not going to come to deal with sin, the author of the Hebrews tells us. He's going to come again to save those who are eagerly waiting for his return. Not to deal with sin, it says explicitly. So I don't think that works, personally. So I believe that this is a reference to his first coming. That this is talking about, again, the establishment of the new covenant. So he's not talking about a future anticipation here. He's talking about the grounds. That is, why is it and how is it that God will save all Israel? That's the point in all of this. He's going to save all Israel through the new covenant, which has already been established. So when it says the deliverer will come from Zion, I believe he means from the earthly Zion. That is to say, he came and he died in Zion, the earthly Zion, died on the cross, and out of that rises from the dead, and that's where he banishes ungodliness from Jacob, starting then and continuing in a process that lasts until he returns. He has done the work to remove the sins of everyone who believes in him, Jew and Gentile alike. So, the covenant's been established. There will not be a separate covenant when Jesus returns. There will not be a new covenant, a second new covenant, another new covenant. No way. Scriptures do not support that idea in any way whatsoever, as far as I can tell. And I don't know many people who would claim such an idea. There are some. But the Redeemer coming from Zion is talking, I think, about the salvation that Jesus has accomplished on the cross when he came to Zion and then left Zion by his resurrection and then ascension. And that's the establishment of the new covenant being described. And so all Paul is doing is to say the basis of the salvation of all Israel, however you shake out the details, is dependent on, rooted in the new covenant that's already been established. That's all he's saying here, I think. Nothing more than that. So that there's no expectation of another new covenant or a separate covenant between Jesus and Israel as an ethnic body or a nation. I don't see any evidence for that in Scripture or in this verse. Instead, he's simply saying the hope of Israel lies in the new covenant, like it does for all the nations. Period. So, let me sketch out the big picture here real fast. And then I might take a couple of questions. So, the whole sequence here, Paul is bringing his argument to a close from Romans 9 through 11. He's not quite done. He's got something else to say here in the next verses, which we'll get to next week. But he's making a big point from Isaiah 59, Isaiah 27, Psalm 14, smashed up together in a mash-up quotation there, to summarize his argument from Romans 9 to 11. And it's all about the sequence. So let me sketch out that sequence for you again. I did it simply last week, that there were 4 elements to the mystery. So we talked about that last week. This is the big picture. And I think you can see it connected in all of these passages. Because what's interesting is Romans 9, Paul quoted from some of these same passages in Isaiah 27, Isaiah 59, in the earlier part of the argument that he's now bringing up again at the end. So let me run through this really quickly. Six points with a few subpoints. Point number 1 is Romans 9:33. God placed a stumbling stone in Zion. That's the key thought, remember? God placed a stumbling stone in Zion. That's talking about God sending Jesus to Zion, the earthly Jerusalem. God placed a stumbling stone in Zion, Romans 9:33. Number 2, Israel stumbled. so that part of Israel was hardened. So I'm connecting Romans 9:32 with Romans 11:11 and Romans 11:25. The hardening of Israel is in connection with their stumbling over the stumbling stone that Paul talked about in Romans 9:32. So in the midst of that, a subpoint to that, so what does Israel's stumbling look like? Well, it's pictured in the olive tree image of the natural branches being broken off. That is a picture of their stumbling. Why were they broken off? Because of unbelief. So in their rejection of their gospel, their refusal to believe in Jesus, they were broken off the olive tree. And they tripped over the stumbling stone. Jesus was presented to them. They tripped over him instead of believed in him. Okay, that's Romans 9:32. So natural branches were broken off the olive tree through their unbelief. Romans 11:17 and 19 to 21 here. Step 3. The deliverer will come from Zion. So remember, the stumbling stone was put in Zion. Now the deliverer is going to come from Zion, drawing sinners into the new covenant relationship established through Jesus' death. Notice I just said sinners. That's Jews and Gentiles together. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4, the preached gospel brings salvation to Gentiles. That's Romans 11:11. And that was pictured for us in the olive tree. Wild olive shoots were grafted into the olive tree through faith in the gospel. So the preached gospel brings salvation to the Gentiles. That's step 4 here. Step 5 then. Gentile salvation provokes Israel to jealousy. Romans 11:11 and 14. The Gentile salvation provokes Israel to jealousy. That's not something that's just going to happen in the future, I don't think. That's going to be the debated point. Is their jealousy something that's ongoing now, or is their jealousy going to be something that happens climactically at the end of history right before Jesus returns or in conjunction with Jesus' return? We'll have to say more about that next time. That's the question on the table that there's so much debate about. Gentile salvation provokes Israel to jealousy, so that's step 5. And finally, step 6 in the sequence, the preached gospel brings salvation to all Israel. Romans 11:26. So what does that look like? Underneath that, in the olive tree image, you have natural branches will be regrafted into the olive tree through faith. So is that what's happening with Paul and those who are believing, that Jewish people who are believing the gospel during his day? Or is that going to be something that happens all of a sudden climactically? So if it's a climactic action at the end of history, we didn't really talk about this with the olive tree. Think about it like this. So if that's true, then that means he doesn't describe in the olive tree image himself or other Jews who are believing the gospel in his day. They're not pictured at all, if that's the truth. If the natural branches that will be regrafted in, if that's just talking about future at the very end of history climactically, then Paul and other Jews in the first century who believe the gospel, they're not pictured in the olive tree at all. They're not there. They're not a part of the picture. I suppose that's possible, but that's hard for me to believe. So I tend to lean toward the natural branches being regrafted in are guys like Paul and thousands of other Jews, and all the Jews who are believing the gospel today, their natural branches being regrafted in. So, finally, how does this happen? God will banish ungodliness and take away the sins of Jacob on the basis of the new covenant established through Jesus' death. So it's all rooted in Jesus' death on the cross here, okay? So it's taking us back to the gospel here, the gospel of the new covenant, and saying that's the only hope for Gentile and Jew alike. That's how God brings salvation to all Israel, however you choose to define that. However you draw that out from Scripture as to who exactly counts as all Israel, which we still need to talk about. However you define that, the point, it really doesn't matter in my view. I wish there wasn't so much heat around that debate, because it doesn't matter. The point is the new covenant is the only hope for anybody on the planet. And then the outcome of that, the application of all of this is you need to be talking about Jesus to everybody, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. It doesn't matter their ethnicity. They need the gospel. There's no other way to save Jews, and there's no other way to save anybody else. They need the new covenant. It's the only way to a relationship with God. It's the only way to live a good life in this world. It's the only way to gain eternal life. Whether you're Jewish or Gentile does not matter. And so we have to be very careful about then how we view Jewish people. We don't view them as either some kind of special class, like they're going to gain salvation from God because of anything. That's not what Paul's teaching us here. Or we say, well, they don't matter, they've been replaced. No, that's the other extreme. We want to go the way that Paul describes here, which is all about they need Jesus, they need the gospel, the new covenant is here for them, it's been established, there's nothing more to be done, there's no more work that needs to be done to save Jews, to save all Israel. All Israel will be complete, however you define that completeness, when Jesus returns. And the way that that completion comes about is through the new covenant. It has a historical progress, which is what Paul's been describing. And the historical progress of that has been surprising to Jewish people because they expected salvation to come to them and Gentiles to be destroyed. Surprise, Gentiles are being saved and Jews are continuing to be judged in mass numbers. Surprise. That was always part of the plan. Questions, comments? John?
Is that hardening and that jealousy, is that why the Jews today refuse to read Isaiah 53 and other passages because they're put their fingers in their ears like, oh,
well, that's probably true for some, but many Jews do read Isaiah 53. They just interpret it differently. Yeah. Don? I think so too, yeah.
So I don't think I think there is a future, with that. But, something that's really got me going this morning is, why do Gentiles, like, really kind of hate Jews? Sorry, it's kind of more, I don't really see it. It's like they're jealous of the Gentiles.
Right.
What's going on with this anti-Semitism? And I don't mean today. I'm talking back in the second, third century, and 1500s.
Sure. Well, it's called people being rebellious, and some people claiming to be Christians and claiming to be churches who are not Christians or churches. There's no support for that. There's no justification for that kind of hostility and treatment against Jewish people or any other ethnicity for that matter. So don't generalize. Let's be careful about that. But it is very true that professing Christians and churches throughout history have disobeyed this very passage significantly and plainly.
Well, it's like the Jews are almost being, by Paul, kind of saying, that they have a legitimate reason to be jealous.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say that Gentiles have a legitimate reason to be jealous.
Nope.
So it's kind of weird for me because I don't understand now looking at it.
Sure.
But there is historical and biblical stuff about people going after Israel.
Sure. Yep. Ed?
Just an aside, could you say that Paul is answering the prophet Habakkuk's quandary as to why he's using Assyria and Babylon? That's one of the themes I thought of when he said that this is making the Jews jealous. Kind of a weird way of going about it, but I guess
It fits. Not sure if that's in his mind, but it fits.
you mentioned Ezekiel 36, and it's, to me, that whole chapter sounds like God's talking to Israel. The book seems to be about Israel. And when he says he's going to give hearts of flesh to those with hearts of stone, that can apply to everybody who's a genetic descendant of Abraham, right?
Right.
He might be inclined to take it that way if he didn't have everything else to go with it.
Right. And then you have to add on to that, what we'll probably talk about more next time, the reality that both in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, where the new covenant is promised to the house of Israel and the house of Judah, that can include Gentiles. In the context of Jeremiah and in the context of Ezekiel, both. You have the anticipation of Gentiles being a part of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And I think that's what we have in the New Testament, is that all Israel is going to include Gentiles in some fashion. How we parse that out is where there's going to be some disagreement. All right, we need to cut it off here today. I need to mention this because I keep forgetting to, but if you care about studying this issue in depth, I know you can't see this very well, but this is one of these multiple views books. So again, talking about Romans 9 to 11 as a whole, 3 views on Israel and the church. And this is a very, very well done study of these issues. And I will tell you that I have held to all 3 of these views at different times in my life. And that's, again, I want to remind you that when you're talking about these 3 views, which are very, very common in different churches, none of these should be outlawed. None of these should be considered heresy. These are all good, faithful approaches to the Scriptures. They just view the conclusions a little bit differently. And if you're interested in studying this is a great tool to study the bigger picture here and to see them dialogue with each other over the details on how things flesh out, particularly with the definition of all Israel and how that shakes out. But all of these are Orthodox Christian views that rise up out of the Scriptures. And where they differ, and where I've differed in my own head over the course of my Christian life, has to do with certain places where there are ambiguities. And this is not an issue when we come down to saying, what does it mean all Israel will be saved? However you define that term, as long as you're not saying something really, really bizarre and out there, there is legitimacy, biblical legitimacy to the different perspectives on this issue, particularly the ones in this book. And so I commend that to you if you're interested in studying it more deeply. When we will maybe look at some of the details of that next time. But we will try to get through verses 28 to 32 next time also. So we'll see how we do. Let me pray real quick because we're over time. Father, thank you again for these pictures. You're telling us more and more about the gospel here. So let's not forget that and lose sight of that in the midst of the debates, in the midst of the difficult understandings of certain texts and how they're used here, and even what Paul's up to when he quotes the Old Testament. These are hard questions to answer for us. And so we pray that you would help us to cut through that and see very clearly the main message that's about the new covenant and about Jesus' work on the cross to establish that covenant. That's always going to be the only hope for anybody on the planet. And so we pray that you would help us to fix our eyes on him and on the work that's been accomplished. There's nothing else that needs to be done. We don't have to work for our salvation, and there's nothing more that Jesus needs to do to accomplish that salvation. The Spirit applies it to us as we believe in the gospel, and that is what we look forward to. And so we thank you that the work is done. When Jesus said it is finished, he meant it. And there's no more that needs to be done to atone for our sins, whether Jew or Gentile. Help us to hold out that message faithfully with our friends, our loved ones, and the people that we meet. So thank you for giving us such a powerful message. It's foolishness to the world, but it's the only truth that will save people. So help us to know it better. Help us to go deeper in our understanding of it so that we can talk about it freely with each other and with those who don't know you yet. So thank you for giving us the powerful word that saves sinners. Help us to draw strength from it and help us to trust you in it more and more as the days go by. For Jesus' sake we pray. Amen.